"You're fired, Gwen. Pack your things and get out before lunch." The words hit me like a slap across the face. I stood in Douglas Brennan's corner office, my performance review folder still clutched in my hands. 22 years I'd given to quantum logistics. 22 years of early mornings and late nights. And this was how it ended. Douglas leaned back in his leather chair, arms crossed over his expensive suit. His lips curved into a smirk that made my blood boil. Behind him, through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the warehouse floor where I'd started as a clerk fresh out of college. "We're bringing in younger talent," he continued, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "People who understand modern business. You've had a good run, but it's time to make room for the next generation." I nodded slowly, keeping my face neutral. What Douglas didn't know was that I'd been expecting this conversation for 3 months. Ever since I'd accidentally received an email thread discussing cost-cutting measures that specifically targeted senior employees. What he really didn't know was what I'd been doing with those 3 months. My name is Gwen Holloway, and I'm 51 years old. For the past 2 decades, I'd worked my way up from inventory clerk to operations director at Quantum Logistics, one of the largest shipping companies in the Midwest. I'd streamlined systems, negotiated contracts, and personally trained most of the management team currently running the company. Douglas Brennan had joined as CEO 3 years ago, brought in by the board to modernize operations. He was 42, ambitious, and had immediately started replacing experienced staff with cheaper, younger workers. I'd watched colleagues with decades of experience escorted out, while fresh graduates took their positions at half the salary. The misdirected email had been my warning sign. It outlined a plan to eliminate the 5 highest-paid non-executive employees over 6 months. My name sat at the top of that list, so instead of panicking, I'd started preparing. I documented everything, backed up files, and most importantly, I'd quietly reached out to someone who'd been waiting for an opportunity like this. "I'll need you to sign this severance agreement," Douglas said, sliding papers across his mahogany desk. 2 weeks for every year of service. Quite generous, really. I picked up the document, scanning the terms I'd already anticipated. The severance was standard, but buried in the legal language was a comprehensive non-compete clause that would prevent me from working in logistics anywhere in the region for 2 years. There was also a strict confidentiality agreement about company operations. "I'll need time to review this with my attorney," I replied calmly. His smirk faltered slightly. "That's not really necessary. It's standard paperwork. We need this signed today." I met his eyes steadily. "I have 48 hours to review any severance agreement under employment law. I'll have my attorney send back a response by Wednesday." The color rose in his cheeks. He wasn't used to pushback. "Fine, but you're still leaving today. Security will escort you out." I nodded, gathering my folder. As I turned to leave, I allowed myself a small smile. Douglas thought he was winning. He had no idea the game had already changed. The security guard who escorted me to my office was Tommy Chen, a young man I'd hired 4 years ago when he was struggling to find work. He kept his eyes down, clearly uncomfortable with the assignment. "I'm sorry, Ms. Holloway," he muttered as we walked past curious colleagues. "Just following orders." I patted his arm gently. "It's okay, Tommy. You're doing your job." In my office, I methodically packed my personal items. Family photos, awards from industry conferences, the coffee mug my team had given me for my 20th anniversary. Everything else, every file and document, I'd already copied to external drives weeks ago. My computer had been remotely wiped by it the moment Douglas fired me. They'd probably been monitoring my activity for weeks. But what they'd been watching was carefully curated work, nothing that revealed my actual preparations. The real information, the truly valuable data, had been backed up months ago on personal devices, never touching company servers. As I placed the last item in my box, Douglas appeared at my door. "I hope there are no hard feelings, Gwen. This is just business." I looked at Douglas standing in my doorway, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent lights. Behind him, I could see my colleagues pretending not to watch this humiliating exit. "Just business," I repeated softly. "Of course." He seemed satisfied by my defeated tone. "You understand. The company needs to evolve. Your methods, while effective in their time, just don't fit our new direction." Our new direction. The direction that had seen customer satisfaction drop 15% in the past year while Douglas cut corners to boost short-term profits. The direction that had lost us 3 major contracts because inexperienced staff couldn't handle complex logistics. But I said nothing, just nodded and picked up my box. As Tommy walked me through the warehouse, workers I'd known for years looked away. Some seemed relieved it wasn't them. Others appeared genuinely sad. Maria, who'd worked in receiving for 18 years, caught my eye and mouthed, "I'm sorry." At my car, Tommy helped me load the box. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. I smiled. "I have some opportunities lined up. Don't worry about me, Tommy." That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing documents I'd been compiling for 3 months. Spreadsheets showing Douglas's cost-cutting decisions that violated safety regulations. Emails proving he'd knowingly shipped damaged goods to avoid delays. Records of kickbacks from vendors in exchange for exclusive contracts. But my most valuable asset wasn't evidence of wrongdoing. It was something far more powerful. Quantum Logistics operated on a proprietary routing system I developed over 15 years. It optimized delivery routes, managed inventory across 12 warehouses, and coordinated with hundreds of carriers. The system had saved the company millions annually and was the backbone of every operation. Douglas knew the system existed, but like most executives, he had no idea how it actually worked. He assumed it was company property, maintained by the IT department. What he didn't know was that I'd built it originally on my own time, using my personal equipment, before Quantum ever invested in it. I'd only licensed it to the company, not sold it. And that license had some very specific terms that Douglas had never bothered to read. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Westfield Transport. I answered, keeping my voice professional. "Hello, Charles." Charles Westfield laughed warmly. "Gwen, I heard the news through the industry grapevine." Douglas actually went through with it. Charles and I had known each other for 20 years. His company, Westfield Transport, was Quantum's primary competitor. We'd always maintained a friendly professional relationship, even speaking at industry conferences together. "He did," I confirmed. "Escorted out by security this morning." Charles whistled low. "That man's an idiot. I've been watching him run Quantum into the ground for 3 years now. The offer still stands, Gwen. Come work for us." Chief Operations Officer position, full executive benefits, and a salary that would make Douglas weep. I smiled. "I appreciate that, Charles, but I'm interested in your other proposal, the consulting contract we discussed." There was a pause, then Charles spoke more seriously. "You're certain that's a much bigger risk?" I looked at the documents spread across my desk. "I'm certain. Send over the contracts. I'll sign by Wednesday, right after I deal with Quantum's severance paperwork." Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. I met with my attorney, Patricia Wu, at her downtown office. She'd reviewed Quantum's severance agreement and had prepared a counteroffer that would change everything. "They're not going to like this," Patricia warned, sliding the amended documents across her desk. "Good," I replied. The changes were simple but significant. I would accept the severance payment, but only if Quantum removed the non-compete clause entirely. I would also require a written acknowledgement that all intellectual property I developed independently remained my property. And finally, I wanted a formal letter stating my departure was part of corporate restructuring, not performance-related. "If they refuse?" Patricia asked. I smiled. "Then I refuse to sign, which means I'm technically still employed. They'd have to fire me for cause, and Douglas doesn't have cause. He'd have to pay out my full contract, which is worth considerably more than this severance." Patricia's eyes gleamed with understanding. "And while they're dealing with that legal headache, other things might come to light." I didn't answer directly, but my expression said everything. "Send it over." By Friday afternoon, Patricia received Quantum's response. Douglas had agreed to everything. My attorney seemed surprised, but I wasn't. Douglas wanted me gone quickly and quietly. He thought removing the non-compete was a small price to pay, probably assuming I was too old and bitter to find comparable work anyway. What he didn't realize was that he'd just freed me to move forward with plans that would devastate his company. That evening, I signed contracts with Westfield Transport. Not as an employee, but as an independent consultant. My role would be to help them implement a new logistics system, one that would revolutionize their operations. The system I would be implementing was, of course, the upgraded version of my routing software. The version I'd been developing on my own time for the past 2 years. The version Quantum had no rights to. Charles had agreed to pay me a substantial consulting fee plus percentage points in the efficiency savings the system generated. Based on my projections, I'd earn more in the first year than my last 3 years at Quantum combined. But money wasn't my primary motivation. Revenge was sweeter than any paycheck. On Monday morning, I sent a formal letter to Quantum's IT department. It was professional, courteous, and absolutely devastating. The letter explained that the licensing agreement for the routing system I developed would not be renewed. Per the original contract terms, which I'd attached, the license expired 90 days after my employment ended. After that date, Quantum would need to negotiate a new licensing agreement at current market rates or cease using the system entirely. I sent copies to Douglas, the board of directors, and Quantum's legal department. Then I waited. The response came within 2 hours. Douglas called me directly, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "What the hell is this, Gwen? You can't just pull our operating system. Everything runs on that software." I kept my voice pleasant. "Actually, Douglas, I can. The licensing agreement is quite clear. I developed the system independently before Quantum invested in it. You've been paying an annual licensing fee, which I kept very reasonable. But now that I'm no longer with the company, I see no reason to continue that arrangement." He sputtered. "This is sabotage. We'll sue you." I let Douglas's threat hang in the air for a moment before responding. "You're welcome to try. My attorney has all the original development documentation, time-stamped and notarized. I built the initial system on my personal computer on my own time before I ever proposed it to Quantum. Your legal team approved the licensing arrangement 20 years ago. It's all properly documented." I heard him breathing heavily on the other end. "What do you want? More money?" "We can negotiate a renewal." This was the moment I'd been planning for months. "I'm willing to discuss a new licensing arrangement. My attorney will send over the terms. Market rate for enterprise logistics software of this complexity with annual increases tied to company revenue." There was a long silence. Finally, Douglas spoke, his voice low. "How much are we talking about?" I quoted him a figure that was 15 times what Quantum had been paying annually. I heard what sounded like him choking. "That's insane. We can't afford that." I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Then you have 90 days to transition to a different system. I'm sure your IT department can handle it. After all, you hired all that young, modern talent." The next 3 weeks were chaos at Quantum, though I only heard about it through my industry contacts. Douglas had called an emergency meeting with the IT department, demanding they reverse engineer my routing system or find a replacement. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the company. My system wasn't just some simple software. It was deeply integrated into every aspect of Quantum's operations. It managed inventory tracking, automated vendor communications, optimized truck routes based on real-time traffic data, coordinated with rail and air freight partners, and generated all customer reporting. Replacing it would require rebuilding their entire operational infrastructure from the ground up. The IT director estimated it would take 18 months and cost millions in development, plus additional millions in lost efficiency during the transition. Major logistics software providers were contacted, but their systems would require extensive customization and still wouldn't match the functionality Quantum's clients had come to expect. Meanwhile, I was implementing my upgraded system at Westfield Transport. The results were immediate and remarkable. Delivery times improved by 20%. Fuel costs dropped by 18%. Customer satisfaction ratings soared. Within 3 weeks, Westfield had poached 2 of Quantum's largest clients. Douglas tried negotiating. He called weekly, each conversation revealing his growing desperation. First, he offered to rehire me, suggesting we could forget this unpleasantness. I declined. Then he tried appealing to my loyalty, reminding me of my years at Quantum. I reminded him of how those years had ended. Finally, he attempted threats again, suggesting I was violating some vague ethical standard. My attorney shut that down with a single letter detailing all the documented safety violations and fraudulent practices we'd uncovered during my evidence gathering. That letter also mentioned that several regulatory agencies might find this information interesting. Douglas went silent after that, but the clock kept ticking. 60 days left on the license. 50 days. 40 days. Quantum stock began sliding as word spread through the industry about their operational crisis. Clients started asking questions about system reliability. Competitors, sensing blood in the water, began aggressive recruiting of Quantum's accounts. I watched it all unfold with calm satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving that experience and expertise couldn't simply be discarded for cheaper alternatives. It was about showing that knowledge had value, that institutional memory mattered, that years of dedication deserved respect. With 30 days remaining on the license, Quantum's board finally intervened. I received a call from Victoria Lang, the board chairperson I'd worked with years ago during a major expansion project. "Gwen, we need to talk," Victoria said, her voice weary. "Not about the licensing negotiation, about Douglas." I remained quiet, letting her continue. "The board has been reviewing his performance. The numbers don't lie. Since he took over, we've lost market share, customer satisfaction has plummeted, and our best people have been pushed out. This situation with your system was the final straw." She paused. "Douglas is being removed as CEO, effective immediately. I'm asking you personally to meet with the board. We want to discuss bringing you back, not as operations director, but as chief operating officer." I let the offer sit for a moment. It was tempting. COO would give me real power, the chance to undo Douglas's damage, but I'd already moved forward. "I appreciate the offer, Victoria, I really do, but I'm committed to Westfield now. However, I'm willing to discuss a reasonable licensing agreement for the routing system, as a gesture of respect for you and the board." The licensing negotiation took 2 days. I met with Victoria and the board's attorney in a neutral conference room downtown. Patricia accompanied me, and together we hammered out terms that were fair but firm. Quantum would pay market rate, which was still significant but not the punitive amount I'd initially quoted Douglas. In exchange, I'd provide 6 months of technical support to ensure smooth, continued operation. I'd also agreed to a non-compete clause, preventing me from licensing the same system to direct competitors within a 50-mile radius. Westfield was outside that radius, so my consulting work continued unaffected. The agreement also included something I'd insisted upon, a formal letter from the board acknowledging my contributions to Quantum over 22 years, and stating that my departure had been a regrettable error in judgment by previous management. Victoria signed without hesitation. "I'm sorry about how this happened, Gwen. Douglas let his ego override good business sense. The company is paying the price for his arrogance." As I left the meeting, signed contracts in hand, I felt a weight lift. This wasn't about destruction. It was about fair recognition and appropriate consequences. Quantum would survive, but they'd learned an expensive lesson. Douglas, however, wasn't done paying yet. 2 weeks after Douglas's removal, the industry news sites exploded with a story. An anonymous whistleblower had provided federal regulators with detailed evidence of safety violations, fraudulent shipping practices, and vendor kickbacks at Quantum Logistics. The documentation was thorough, time-stamped, and absolutely damning. Federal investigators arrived at Quantum's headquarters within days. Douglas, as the CEO during the period when most violations occurred, was named as the primary subject of the investigation. His professional reputation, already damaged by his forced departure, was now completely destroyed. I'd waited to release the evidence until after the licensing agreement was finalized. I'd wanted Quantum to have a chance to recover under new leadership, but Douglas himself deserved no such consideration. The investigation would take months, but industry experts were already predicting significant fines and possible criminal charges. Douglas hired expensive attorneys and released statements claiming he'd been set up by disgruntled former employees. But the evidence spoke for itself. I never publicly acknowledged being the whistleblower. I didn't need to. Everyone in the industry knew. And that knowledge brought me something more valuable than revenge. It brought respect. 3 months after my firing, I attended the Midwest Logistics Conference, the same conference where I'd been presenting innovations for 20 years. This time, I walked in not as Quantum's operations director, but as an independent consultant with a revolutionary system that was transforming the industry. The conference center buzzed with energy. Colleagues I'd known for decades approached with congratulations. Young professionals asked for business cards. Equipment vendors wanted to discuss integration possibilities. Charles Westfield found me during the opening reception, grinning widely. "You're the talk of the conference. 3 companies have already approached me asking about your system. I told them to get in line." I smiled. "We'll have to be selective. I don't want to overextend." A voice behind me spoke coldly. "Enjoying your moment of glory, Gwen?" I turned to find Douglas standing there, looking haggard. He'd aged noticeably in 3 months. The expensive suit couldn't hide the stress in his face. "Hello, Douglas. I didn't realize you'd be attending." His laugh was bitter. "I'm here to rebuild my reputation, to show the industry that I'm still relevant." Charles stepped between us protectively, but I touched his arm. "It's fine." Douglas moved closer, lowering his voice so only we could hear. "You destroyed me. Everything I'd built, my career, my reputation, gone because you couldn't handle being fired." I met his eyes steadily. "No, Douglas, you destroyed yourself. I simply documented it. Every safety violation, every fraudulent practice, every kickback, those were your decisions. Just made sure they didn't remain hidden." His face flushed red. "You manipulated the situation. That licensing agreement, the timing of the whistleblower report, it was all calculated." I nodded. "It was, just like your plan to fire me was calculated. The difference is my actions were legal and ethical. Yours weren't." Someone called my name from across the room. A conference organizer was waving, indicating it was time for my presentation. "If you'll excuse me," I said to Douglas. "I have a keynote to deliver." As I walked away, Charles whispered, "That took restraint. I wanted to punch him." I smiled. "Revenge isn't about punching. It's about proving them wrong in ways they can't argue with." The conference room was packed for my presentation. Standing room only. I spoke about innovation in logistics, about the importance of experience working alongside fresh perspectives, and about building systems that valued both efficiency and ethics. After the presentation, the questions lasted an hour. Young engineers wanted technical details. Company representatives asked about implementation timelines. Academics inquired about publishing papers on the methodology. Through it all, I could see Douglas in the back of the room, watching with barely concealed fury. When the session finally ended, Victoria Lang approached me. "The board would like to extend another offer, Gwen. We've restructured management completely. New leadership, new priorities. We want you back as Chief Operating Officer, with full authority and a compensation package that reflects your true value." I considered it. Quantum was being rebuilt properly now. It could be satisfying to return triumphantly. But I discovered something in the past 3 months. I enjoyed the freedom of consulting, of choosing my projects, of building something new rather than fixing someone else's mistakes. "I'm honored, Victoria, but I'm going to decline. However, I'd be happy to continue our licensing agreement and perhaps take on occasional consulting projects." She smiled sadly but nodded. "I understand. The offer remains open if you change your mind." As the conference wound down, Tommy found me near the exit. The young security guard looked uncomfortable. "Ms. Holloway, I wanted to apologize again." I stopped Tommy before he could continue. "You don't need to apologize, you were doing your job." He shook his head. "It wasn't just following orders, I should have spoken up. When Mr. Brennan started pushing out experienced people, replacing them with younger workers who'd accept lower pay, I should have said something. We all should have." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "What matters is what you do now. Learn from what happened. When you see something wrong, find a way to address it. But do it smart, do it documented, and do it legal." Tommy nodded seriously. "I wanted you to know I quit Quantum last week. The new management is better, but after everything that happened, I needed a fresh start. I'm starting at Westfield next month. Mr. Charles said you recommended me." I smiled. "You're a good worker, Tommy. You deserve better than how Douglas treated the staff. Charles will appreciate your dedication." After he left, I stood in the conference center lobby watching people network and discuss business. A year ago, I'd been one of them, comfortable in my position at Quantum, unaware of the betrayal being planned. Now I was something different, an independent force in the industry, respected not just for my experience but for my strength. 6 months after my firing, I sat in my home office reviewing quarterly reports. Westfield Transport had grown by 38% since implementing my system. They'd acquired 4 of Quantum's former major clients and were negotiating with 2 more. My consulting income had exceeded my previous salary by 60%, and I had a waiting list of companies wanting to license my routing technology. Douglas had disappeared from the industry. The federal investigation had resulted in substantial fines and a permanent ban from holding executive positions in federally regulated industries. He tried launching a consulting business, but no one would hire him. His LinkedIn profile showed increasingly desperate attempts to rebrand himself, each more pathetic than the last. Quantum, under Victoria's leadership, had stabilized. They'd rehired several of the experienced workers Douglas had pushed out and were slowly rebuilding their reputation. The company would survive, though it would take years to fully recover. My phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but I answered anyway. "Ms. Holloway, this is Brenda from Channel 7 News. We're doing a story on workplace age discrimination in tech industries. We've heard about your situation with Quantum Logistics. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" I paused, considering the reporter's request. Going public with my story would have consequences, both positive and negative. "What angle are you taking with the story?" I asked carefully. Brenda's voice was professional but sympathetic. "We're focusing on how experienced workers are being pushed out in favor of younger, cheaper employees. Your situation represents a unique case where the fired employee actually had leverage to fight back. We think it's an important story." I thought about all the colleagues I'd watched escorted out over the years, people who'd dedicated decades to their companies, only to be discarded when they became too expensive. Most of them hadn't had the resources or positioning to fight back. "I'll do the interview," I decided, "but I want to make it clear this isn't just about me. This is about a systemic problem in how companies treat experienced workers." The interview aired 2 weeks later during prime time. I spoke about my experience, about the 3 months I'd spent preparing after discovering Douglas's plan, and about how I'd protected myself through careful documentation and understanding of my legal rights. I also talked about the dozens of other workers who'd been pushed out and didn't have the same options I did. The interview went viral. Within days, it had been shared across social media platforms, featured in business publications, and discussed on industry podcasts. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, and consulting inquiries. Several law firms reached out, representing other workers in similar situations who wanted to know their rights. 3 major companies announced policy reviews of their treatment of senior employees. The Department of Labor launched an investigation into age discrimination practices in the logistics industry. But the most satisfying response came from unexpected places. I received emails from dozens of people, mostly women over 40, thanking me for showing that it was possible to fight back against workplace discrimination. They shared their own stories of being pushed out, devalued, or forced to accept unfair terms. Some asked for advice. Others just wanted to share their experiences with someone who understood. I responded to every single one, offering what guidance I could. Many I referred to employment attorneys or advocacy organizations. Some I hired as consultants for various projects, recognizing that their experience had value even if their former employers hadn't. Douglas tried to respond to the media attention with his own statement, claiming I'd manipulated the situation and that his firing had nothing to do with my departure. No one believed Douglas's statement. The timeline was too clear, the documentation too thorough. Industry analysts pointed out that my licensing agreement predated my firing by 15 years, and that all my actions had been legal and transparent. His attempt to rewrite the narrative only made him look worse. A business magazine published a detailed analysis of what they called the quantum collapse, examining how Douglas's short-term cost-cutting had nearly destroyed a decades-old company. The article used internal documents and interviews with former employees to paint a picture of an executive more concerned with quarterly profits than long-term sustainability. The piece ended with a warning to other companies about the dangers of devaluing institutional knowledge and experience. Meanwhile, my consulting business continued growing. I'd hired 2 associates, both experienced logistics professionals who'd been forced out of their companies. Together, we were developing an expanded version of my routing system that could be adapted for different industries. Charles Westfield joined me for dinner one evening, raising his glass in a toast. "To Gwen Holloway, who turned a firing into an empire," I laughed. "Hardly an empire, but it's mine, and that makes all the difference." He nodded seriously. "You've changed the conversation in this industry. Companies are rethinking how they treat experienced workers." 1 year after Douglas fired me, I attended Quantum Logistics' annual shareholder meeting as an invited guest. Victoria had asked me to present the new licensing agreement to shareholders as part of their operational update. The conference room was packed with investors, analysts, and company leadership. I stood at the podium, looking out at faces that ranged from curious to concerned. Many remembered me from my years with the company. "A year ago, I left Quantum under difficult circumstances," I began, my voice steady and clear. "Today, I'm here to discuss how Quantum and I have built a new, mutually beneficial relationship that serves both the company's needs and respects the value of the innovations I developed." I walked them through the licensing agreement, explaining how it provided Quantum with continued access to essential technology while fairly compensating its creator. I discussed the importance of protecting intellectual property and valuing the people who create it. When I finished, the room erupted in applause. Afterward, several shareholders approached me with business cards and investment offers. Victoria hugged me warmly. "Thank you, Gwen, for giving us another chance," I smiled. "Thank you for recognizing the mistake and fixing it." As I left the building, I passed the security desk where Tommy once stood. The young man there nodded respectfully. Outside, my car was parked in a visitor spot, not the employee garage where I'd parked for 22 years. I drove away from Quantum for what I knew would be the last time, not as a fired employee, but as a successful consultant who turned humiliation into vindication. Douglas had tried to discard me, to replace experience with cheap youth. Instead, he'd freed me to build something better than I'd ever had at Quantum. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction. It's proving that they needed you more than you needed them, and living well enough that everyone can see it. Kindly go to our channel for the full story. Subscribe for more true stories. Bye for now.